I was only 8 when I realized my home wasn't safe. My stepmother's scolding, sharp and unrelenting, echoed through the narrow hallways of our cramped house. Her voice was a blade, slicing through the thin walls of my small room, where I'd retreat to escape her wrath. The loneliness there was a heavy thing, pressing down on my chest like a stone. It wasn't just the absence of company, it was the feeling of being unwanted, an intruder in my own home. Those early memories, jagged and raw, shaped me in ways I couldn't yet understand. But even then, curled up on my thin mattress with the springs poking through, I made a promise to myself. I'd never let their cruelty define my future. My name is Mia, and this is the story of how I kept that promise, and how, in time, I turned the tables on those who had tried to break me. The house I grew up in sat on the edge of a small, dusty town where the pavement crumbled into gravel roads and fields of tall grass stretched toward the horizon. It was a squat, peeling structure, its faded yellow paint flaking like old skin. The windows rattled in their frames when the wind blew, and the roof leaked during heavy rains, leaving rusty stains on the ceiling. It was the kind of place where dreams seemed to wither before they could take root, but I refused to let mine die. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the cracks in the plaster, imagining a life beyond those walls. A life where I was the one in control. My father was a shadow in my life, a quiet man with tired eyes who worked long hours at the local factory. He left before dawn and returned after dark, his shoulders slumped under the weight of exhaustion. He wasn't unkind, but he was distant, his love buried beneath years of defeat. I wanted to reach him, to find the man who must have once smiled, but he was like a ghost, present but untouchable. My stepmother, Clara, ruled the house in his absence. She was a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and a sharper tongue, her disapproval a constant hum in the background of my days. Her presence filled the house like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive, always ready to unleash its fury on me. Clara had 2 children from a previous marriage, Ethan and Lila, both older than me. Ethan was 12 when I was 8, a wiry boy with a cruel streak that he wielded like a weapon. He'd trip me in the hallway or hide my schoolbooks, his laughter cold and mocking, as if my pain was his entertainment. Lila, 10 at the time, was quieter, her cruelty more subtle. She'd watch Ethan's antics with a faint smile, never joining in but never stopping him either. Together, they formed a unit, a fortress I could never breach. I was the outsider, the child from my father's first marriage, a reminder of a past Clara wanted to erase. To her, I was an inconvenience, a blemish on her perfect family portrait. My real mother was a distant memory, like a photograph left too long in the sun. She died when I was 3, taken by a sudden illness no one ever explained to me. All I had of her was a single photograph, tucked away in a drawer, showing a woman with warm eyes and a smile that seemed to promise safety. I'd stare at it sometimes, tracing her features, wondering if she'd have loved me enough to shield me from Clara's scorn. That photograph was my secret treasure, a fragile link to a life I could barely remember but desperately wanted to believe in. It fueled my quiet resolve, a reminder that I came from something better. Clara's scolding wasn't just words, it was a performance designed to diminish. She'd stand in the kitchen, hands on her hips, her voice rising like a storm. "You're useless, Mia," she'd say, her eyes glinting with something close to satisfaction. "Can't even set the table right. What good are you?" The words stung, but it was the way she said them, the way her lips curled in disdain, that made me feel small, insignificant. Ethan would smirk from the corner, egging her on with his silent approval, and Lila would look away, her silence louder than any insult. I'd swallow the hurt, my throat tight with unshed tears, and retreat to my room as soon as I could, the door clicking shut like a barrier against their world. My room was barely a room at all, a converted storage space just big enough for a bed and a rickety desk. The walls were bare, the paint peeling in strips, and the single window looked out onto a patch of dirt where nothing grew. But in that room, I could be alone. I could dream. I'd sit at my desk, a notebook open in front of me, and write stories about faraway places, castles in the clouds, forests alive with magic, cities where no one ever felt unwanted. In those stories, I was brave. I was strong. I was someone who mattered. Those pages were my rebellion, a quiet defiance against the cruelty that tried to define me. They were my first weapon, though I didn't know it yet. The promise I made at 8 wasn't a grand declaration. It was a quiet thing, whispered to the shadows as I lay in bed, the springs digging into my back. I didn't know how I'd keep it, only that I had to. The world outside my window felt vast and unknowable, but I clung to the idea that somewhere, somehow, I could build a life where I belonged. That promise became my anchor, pulling me through the darker days. School became my escape, though it wasn't perfect. The elementary school was a mile's walk from home, and I'd trudge along the gravel roads, my 2 small shoes kicking up dust. The other kids weren't cruel, not like Ethan, but they kept their distance. I was the quiet girl with the frayed backpack, the one who never spoke unless called on. But in the classroom, I found something I couldn't find at home, a spark of possibility. My 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Harper, was a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes and a knack for noticing the unnoticed. She saw me, really saw me, in a way no one else did. One day, after I'd turned in a short story for a class assignment, Mrs. Harper called me to her desk. My stomach twisted with fear. I was used to criticism, not attention. But she smiled, holding up my paper. "Mia, this is beautiful," she said. "You have a gift." Her words were like sunlight breaking through a storm. For the first time, I felt seen, not as an unwanted burden but as someone with something to offer. That moment planted a seed in me, a belief that my stories, my dreams, could be a way out. It was the beginning of my quiet revolution. I started spending more time at school, lingering in the library after classes ended. The librarian, Mrs. Tate, let me stay as long as I wanted, her gray hair pulled back in a bun, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. The library was a sanctuary, its shelves lined with books that promised adventure and hope. I'd lose myself in tales of heroes and far-off lands, imagining myself as the protagonist, brave and unbroken. I began to write more, filling notebooks with stories of girls who faced dragons and won, who built homes where no one was ever turned away. Each word was a step toward freedom. At home, things grew worse as I got older. Clara's temper sharpened, as if my growing independence threatened her control. She'd find fault in everything I did. My chores were never done well enough, my grades never high enough. Ethan's pranks turned meaner. Once, he poured water into my backpack, ruining my notebook and the stories I'd spent weeks writing. I cried that night, not just for the lost words but for the reminder that my world was fragile, easily torn apart. But I didn't stop writing. I couldn't. It was the one thing Clara and Ethan couldn't take from me. Instead, I hid my work better, burying it under loose floorboards, where their prying eyes couldn't reach. By the time I was 12, I'd learned to navigate the house like a shadow, avoiding Clara's wrath whenever possible. I'd slip out early for school, eat my dinner quickly, and retreat to my room before Ethan could find a new way to torment me. My father noticed the tension but never spoke of it. Once, I caught him looking at me with something like guilt in his eyes, but he turned away before I could say anything. I wanted to scream at him, to beg him to see me, to protect me, but I didn't know how. Instead, I poured my anger and hurt into my stories, where I could control the endings. In those pages, the villains always got what they deserved, not through violence, but through the truth that exposed them. High school brought new challenges but also new opportunities. The town's high school was bigger, louder, and more intimidating than my elementary school, but it had a creative writing club, led by Mr. Daniels, an English teacher with a passion for literature. I joined on a whim, nervous but desperate for a place to belong. The club was small, just a handful of students who met after school in a classroom that smelled of chalk and old books. For the first time, I shared my stories with others, my voice trembling as I read aloud. To my surprise, they listened. They clapped. They told me my words were powerful. In that room, I wasn't the unwanted girl from a broken home. I was a writer, someone with a voice. Mr. Daniels became my mentor, encouraging me to submit my work to contests and literary magazines. When I won a regional writing competition at 15, the prize, a $100 check and a certificate, felt like a lifeline. I hid the money in a tin box under my bed, along with my mother's photograph and my favorite notebook. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a tangible piece of the future I'd promised myself. That win fueled my determination, but it also sowed the seeds of revenge. I began to think about how my words could one day turn back on those who had hurt me, not to destroy, but to reveal. Clara didn't care about my success. If anything, it made her colder. "Don't get too full of yourself," she'd say, her eyes narrowing. "You're still nothing special." But her words didn't cut as deeply anymore. I'd found something she couldn't touch, a spark of belief in myself. I started dreaming bigger, imagining a life beyond the town, beyond the peeling house and Clara's scorn. I wanted to go to college, to study writing, to build a world where I could be free. And quietly, in the back of my mind, I began outlining a story, a true one, about a girl like me, and the family that tried to crush her spirit. The summer before my senior year, everything changed. I was 17, working part-time at the local diner to save for college applications. The diner was a greasy, bustling place, but I loved it, the hum of conversation, the clatter of plates, the way I could blend into the background while still being part of something alive. One evening, a woman came in, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes sharp and curious. She ordered coffee and sat at the counter, scribbling in a notebook. I recognized her immediately, Sarah Ellison, a local author who'd published a novel about life in small-town America. I'd read it in the library, devouring her words like they were a map to a better world. I mustered the courage to approach her, my hands shaking as I refilled her coffee. "I loved your book," I blurted out. She looked up, surprised, then smiled. We talked for an hour that night, about writing, about dreams, about the way stories could change lives. Before she left, she handed me her card. "Keep writing, Mia," she said. "You've got something special." That encounter lit a fire in me. I started emailing Sarah drafts of my stories, and she responded with feedback, encouraging me to refine my craft. She told me about scholarships for young writers, programs I'd never heard of. With her guidance, I applied to colleges with strong creative writing programs, pouring my heart into essays about my life, my struggles, and the promise I'd made to myself. When the acceptance letters arrived, I cried, not out of sadness, but out of hope. I'd been offered a full scholarship to a small liberal arts college 3 states away, a place where I could start over. Leaving home was harder than I expected. Not because I loved the house or the town, but because it meant confronting my father. The night before I left, I found him in the living room, staring at the television. I sat beside him, my heart pounding. "I'm going to college," I said. "I'm going to make something of myself." He looked at me, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't name, regret, maybe, or pride. "I know you will," he said softly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Clara didn't say goodbye. Ethan and Lila ignored me as I packed my bags. But as I walked out the door, my tin box tucked under my arm, I felt lighter than I ever had. The world was waiting, vast and uncertain, but I was ready. I'd kept my promise, not just to survive but to thrive, to build a life where I was wanted, where my stories could soar. Little did I know, that departure was just the beginning. The real revenge would come later, woven into the fabric of my success. At college, I found my place. I studied literature and writing, surrounded by people who saw me for who I was, not who I'd been told I was. I published my first short story in a literary magazine during my sophomore year, and by graduation, I was working on a novel, a story about a girl who refused to let cruelty define her. Sarah became my mentor and friend, cheering me on as I navigated the world of publishing. But as I wrote, the past crept back in. My novel evolved, drawing more from my life than I'd intended. It became a memoir in disguise, the characters thinly veiled versions of Clara, Ethan, Lila, and my father. I changed names, of course, but the truths were there. The scoldings, the pranks, the silence that enabled it all. After graduation, I moved to a bustling city, far from the dusty town. My apartment was small but mine, with walls lined with books and a desk overlooking a park. I worked as a freelance writer, scraping by on articles and editing gigs while polishing my manuscript. Sarah connected me with an agent, and to my astonishment, the book sold. Shadows of Home hit the shelves when I was 24, a raw account of childhood abuse, resilience, and the power of self-belief. It wasn't a bestseller at first, but reviews praised its honesty, and it found an audience among those who'd endured similar pains. The revenge began subtly. Word spread back to my hometown. I'd kept tabs through old school friends on social media, and soon I heard whispers. Clara had seen the book in a local store, her face paling as she flipped through the pages. Ethan, now in his late 20s and stuck in a dead-end job, raged about it online, calling it lies, in a post that only drew more attention to the book. Lila, married with kids, sent me a message, the first contact in years, begging me to take it down, claiming it was ruining their lives. My father called, his voice trembling. "Mia, is this about us?" he asked. I didn't deny it. "It's my story," I said. I had to tell it. The book's success grew. It was optioned for a film, and I did interviews, speaking openly about emotional abuse and the importance of breaking cycles. Clara's reputation in the town crumbled. Neighbors who'd once seen her as the perfect homemaker now whispered about her cruelty. Ethan lost friends, his bullying past exposed. Lila distanced herself from the family, perhaps seeing her own complicity for the first time. My father, retired now, sought therapy, reaching out to me with apologies that came too late but still mattered. He admitted his failures, his silence, and we began a tentative reconciliation. But my revenge wasn't about destruction, it was about justice through truth. I didn't seek their downfall, I sought my own rise. The book royalties allowed me to buy a house, to travel, to mentor young writers from broken homes. At 25, I stood on a stage at a literary festival, reading from my work to a crowd that applauded not just the words, but the strength behind them. Clara showed up once, uninvited, her face gaunt. She approached me afterward, her voice a whisper. "You've ruined us," she said. I looked her in the eye. "No," I replied. "You tried to ruin me. I just survived, and thrived. Now, at 30, I've written more books, built a family of my own with a partner who sees me fully. The scars from my childhood are still there, faint but present, reminders of where I came from. But they don't define me. I kept my promise, and in doing so, I claimed my revenge. Not through hate, but through the unyielding power of my voice." The girl who whispered promises in the dark had become the woman who shouted truths to the world. And that was enough, more than enough.